Albert Speer, one of Hitler's leading aides and closest friends. Technocrat, visionary architect, and Minister of Armaments and War Production. Albert Speer was the man who kept the Führer's wheels of war turning. His most heinous crime, the exploitation and murder of millions of slave laborers, starved, beaten, worked to death in his factories. Albert Speer had blood on his hands. After the war, the Allies were desperate to hunt him down. But this was an unusual Nazi hunt, because two groups of hunters were after him. One wanted Speer to pay for his crimes and bring him to justice. But the other, led by the American businessman Paul Nitze, wanted his help. They would turn Speer into an American collaborator. When Speer finally stood trial, it seemed he was treated lightly when many others were sentenced to death. When he later emerged from prison, he became rich and successful.
But I can tell you that I'm quite glad to be outside here.
Everyone's favorite Nazi. It begged the question, had Speer done a deal that meant his true guilt was overlooked?
Here is a news flash. The German radio has just announced that Hitler is dead. I repeat that, Hitler is dead.
30th of April 1945. The Führer, who had plunged the world into war, was finally gone. Germany lay in ruins. The Nazi leadership descended into chaos. It was each man for himself. Albert Speer, Hitler's former architect and Minister for Armaments and War Production, now found himself on the run. Speer knew his role at the heart of the Reich meant the Allies would hunt him down. So he had to make his move. As German troops desperately fought on and destroyed anything of value to the enemy, Speer began a perilous journey. He traveled through the crumbling Reich to the doomed regime's final hiding place at Flensburg, near the Danish border. As Speer finally made it to the picturesque town of Flensburg, he would have known the Nazi hunters were already on his trail. In 1943, the Big Four allies, Britain, the US, France, and the Soviet Union, had decided that the Nazi elite must pay for their crimes. After bitter wranglings, they agreed that putting them in the dock, rather than summary execution, would be the best way to hold them to account. There would be war crimes trials. Nothing like it had ever been done before. That determination to make the Nazis pay grew stronger as the Allies uncovered the true horror of the Nazi regime's camps.
The German concentration camp at Buchenwald. 10 British MPs have come to see for themselves. They came to see the whipping block. to talk with the living, to look at the dead, to see the cremation ovens the world did not believe existed.
Teams of investigators and prosecutors followed the relentless Allied advance. Their mission? To hunt down war criminals and mass murderers. Liberated prisoners of war reported Nazis suspected of war crimes. Concentration camp survivors sought out their former guards. And intelligence agents chased the big Nazis. The likes of Albert Speer knew they could expect no mercy.
Kann ich nur zur Antwort geben für eine Regierung nach eurer Wirtschaft.
Speer had witnessed a speech by the Führer in 1931, and the young architect soon fell under Hitler's spell.
Wir wollen nicht liegen und wollen nicht schwindeln. Ich habe es halt.
In the same year, he became Nazi Party member number 474481. It was Speer's training as an architect that would seal his rise through the ranks. He began by working on a series of architectural jobs for high-ranking Nazis. His work for them would seal his reputation and enable him to gain access to Hitler. Little by little, Speer managed to get closer to the Führer's side.
Hitler loved going to building sites. It was his passion. And Speer would walk behind him every day, and Hitler never looked at him. Speer told me, as far as he was concerned, Hitler had never seen him.
Then at last, he was noticed.
When that particular day, Hitler turned around at the end of his walkthrough and said to Speer, "Kommen Sie essen. Come and have lunch." And Speer said it was all totally unreal. This was the greatest man on earth. This was the man everybody wanted just one look from. And here he was next to me, and he never spoke to anyone else throughout the lunch.
His relationship with his new master blossomed. Speer was accepted into the Führer's innermost circle. The two became firm friends. He was commissioned to work on a number of grandiose buildings, including a new Reich chancellery in Berlin. But his most famous work was the Rally Stadium at Nuremberg, a spectacular showcase arena for Adolf Hitler's Third Reich.
Speer loved Hitler. No doubt Hitler responded to that. I mean, there is no doubt that Speer, had Hitler wished for a son, this is the son he would have wanted.
When war broke out in 1939 and city after city fell to the Nazis, Speer supported his Führer's aggression. After the defeat of France, he stood at his master's side as they surveyed the fallen city of Paris in June 1940. But this massive war effort created huge problems. The German war machine had a voracious appetite for weapons. When Adolf Hitler struck east in 1941 and took on the vast forces of the Soviet Union, the German arms industry was stretched to breaking point. So on February the 8th, 1942, Albert Speer was plunged into Hitler's war. Hitler appointed him Minister of Armaments. That put him at the very center of the German war effort. He found himself in control of vast swathes of industry and millions of conscripted workers. This political role close to the Führer would have been guilt enough, but it was the methods Albert Speer employed that were most incriminating. His most heinous crime: he had kept the German war machine working through the use of slave labor. Speer had realized that with so many men away at the front, he had a major problem: an acute shortage of manpower. Unlike in Russia, Britain, or America, German women were never widely mobilized to work in factories. So he turned for help to an old acquaintance. Fritz Sauckel, Germany's Minister of Labor. Sauckel responded by drafting in millions of people from the territories that Germany had conquered to keep Speer's war effort on track. They were slave workers. Forced to live in squalid conditions, half-starved and worked to death, these laborers died in massive numbers, as Ted Misovich, a former internee, explains.
It was exhausting, it was debilitating and all the other things, even denigrating and so on, poorly fed. Food was very bad, inadequate, but it was in accordance with German philosophy that provided you last 6 months, you're expendable because they'll bring some more people to work. Eventually, you could see them walking, skeletons, just pure skeletons, Walking, and if they fell down, they stayed down, they wouldn't get up.
They could be worked to death, literally. I mean, you didn't have to worry about them, you didn't have to provide anything. They just slept where they could on the ground in these terrible underground factories.
It seems that Speer hadn't cared where the workers came from or how appallingly they were treated. All that mattered was keeping Hitler's war machine going. So as he awaited his fate in Flensburg, Speer knew the hangman's noose was near. The war crimes investigators were closing in. But as the war drew to a close, there was another man who was also after Speer. And he didn't want to hang him. He wanted Speer's help, and he was desperate to get to him before he could be put on trial. Paul Nitze was an economist and banker based in London. But he wasn't working for war crimes investigators. He was employed by a curious agency called the United States Strategic Bombing Survey. Known as the USSBS, it was an amalgam of both military and civilian personnel. Theirs was a very specific mission: to learn all they could about the effects of one of the Allies' key military innovations, an innovation that they had hoped would win them the war: strategic bombing. The Allied strategic bombing campaign in Europe had begun in earnest in 1943. The idea was that carpet bombing would defeat the enemy by destroying its economic ability to wage war. Day and night, American and British bombers targeted not German troops, but German cities. In accordance with the strategy, Germany and its industry was hammered around the clock.
0R 1320. Your altitude will be 22,000 feet, which is your bombing altitude, and the place will be the target.
The Americans had a particularly strong belief in strategic bombing. Bombers escorted by long-range fighter aircraft attacked oil refineries, factories, railways, ports, and power plants throughout central and eastern Germany.
Target for today. It may be a locomotive works in Poland, an aerodrome in Hungary, an oil field in Romania, or a tank factory in Germany itself. Whatever the target, today's mission will prove again that no objective in German Europe is secure from American bombers.
Anything which contributed to the German war effort was blitzed. Carpet bombing pitted the Allies directly against Albert Speer, whose job it was to keep German industry churning out armaments. And it seemed that Speer won. Strategic bombing did not turn out to be the knockout blow the Allies had hoped for. Even though German civilians died in their thousands and suffered terribly, no matter how much the Allied bombers pounded Germany, the country did not buckle. And although the armaments industry was badly hit, Albert Speer had kept it running. Despite huge pressures, Germany kept fighting.
On the coast of Normandy, between Cherbourg and the Seine, Allied landings secured a bridgehead wide and deep.
In the end, the Allies had no choice but to go in on the ground and fight for every bloody mile of German territory.
And the drive goes on. Hanover is captured, and civilians wave white handkerchiefs and line the streets to watch a victorious army rumble through to the east.
Even so, at the end of the war in Europe, the Americans had faith in strategic bombing. They hoped it could bring a swift end to the war against Japan. But first they needed to find out what had gone wrong in Germany. Lead investigator Paul Nitze was ordered to get hold of Speer and extract as much information as possible. That way, perhaps he could learn lessons that would help America defeat Japan. Paul Nitze had to find Speer. And fast, before the war crimes investigators could lock him away in prison. So Nitze made an immediate play for his target. Convinced that Speer had fled to Flensburg, he sent 2 of his best men to snatch him. They quickly located the target. Albert Speer was living at Glucksburg, a 16th century castle a few miles from Flensburg. As the Americans wandered through the endless corridors and rooms, they came across a door marked with a white card. It read simply, Reichsminister Speer. They knocked and entered. Speer, whom they recognized immediately, looked up. They had won the race. The US SBS had their man. News that Speer had been captured was quickly relayed to London. Paul Nitze could scarcely contain his excitement. He was soon on board a DC-3, heading for Flensburg. He would be able to interrogate the captured Nazi at length and find out all he needed to know. Albert Speer, meanwhile, had just been thrown a lifeline. His expertise would give him valuable bargaining power when it came to trying to save his life. To get the answers he needed, US Bombing Survey Chief Paul Nitze drafted in some surprising investigators. 2 senior US SBS colleagues arrived at Glucksburg Castle, ready to debrief the former Minister of Armaments and War Production. J.K. Galbraith was an academic, author, and editor of Fortune magazine. He was already famous as a liberal economist and had advised the US government. Now he worked for the US SBS. His colleague, George Ball, was a lawyer who had served in Washington on various government projects. For the next 10 days, the US SBS would subject Speer to a detailed and forensic interrogation. And Speer was soon singing like a canary. He flooded his interrogators with detailed information on the effects of the Allied bombing campaign and spoke at length about the Nazi war machine and how it worked. He helped explain how he'd made Nazi industry more efficient.
We do our best to provide our sons and our fathers and our brothers with the weapons which are necessary.
Speer described how he introduced a comprehensive program of rationalization and put real businessmen and engineers in charge of it, instead of military men like Goering and his 4-year plan office. Men who knew what they were talking about were given responsibility for areas of production. Speer also explained how, to beat the air attacks, he had resorted to taking factories underground. That was how he had built Hitler's so-called vengeance weapons, the deadly V-2 supersonic rocket and the V-1, or Doodlebug. He even told the Americans where they could find the records of what he had done during the war, including his personal reports to Hitler, which were stored in a safe in Munich. He gave them the keys and combination to the safe, enabling Nitze to dispatch someone immediately. George Ball found Speer to be astonishingly open and helpful. His knowledge, said Ball, was absolutely astounding. General F.L. Anderson, commander of the US 8th Air Force Bomber Fleet, would later say, "Had I known what this man was achieving, I would have sent out the entire American 8th Air Force merely to put him underground." The more Speer spoke, the more it seemed to Paul Nitze that he was mainly concerned with saving his own skin. Nitze later remarked, "It became evident right away that Speer was worried he might be declared a war criminal." After 8 days of interrogation, Nitze learned that Speer and the rest of the German government in Flensburg were to be arrested in 2 days' time. Nitze only had 48 hours. He needed to step up the pressure. He now wanted to hear everything Speer had to say about his relationship with Adolf Hitler, but also his exploitation of slave workers. Whilst open about most things, he was evasive when pushed about the concentration camps and the terrible treatment of the Jews and slave workers that had underpinned his career. Speer said he had no idea what was going on. No idea about the thousands of slave workers who had been murdered or worked to death to make the Nazi weapons of war. His interrogators found this difficult to believe, given what they were witnessing at the camps. But Speer's 10-day interrogation came to an abrupt end early on the morning of May the 23rd, when British troops arrived at Glucksburg Castle to arrest him.
At Flensburg, just below the Danish border, the Allies formally dissolved the acting German government headed by Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz. Numerous officers of the German High Command and the interim administration are arrested as prisoners of war on 23rd May. Among the more prominent Nazis seized under the Supreme Headquarters Directive are Admiral Dönitz, Colonel General Gustav Jodl, and Albert Speer, Minister of Economics and Production.
By now, the US SBS team had what they needed, so they were gone. They dispersed to continue their work elsewhere. If they had any nagging doubts about his culpability, they kept them to themselves. Paul Nitze would go on to be a Washington insider after the war. He helped formulate the United States Cold War missile defense strategy during the 1960s and was one of the main architects of the US strategy towards the Soviet Union. J.K. Galbraith went back to his stellar career as a leading economist, academic, and prolific author. George Ball worked for various US administrations, including that of Kennedy and Lyndon B. Johnson, and became US ambassador to the United Nations. During the Vietnam War in the mid-1960s, Ball even opposed carpet bombing, which, he argued, would be as ineffective as it had been in Germany during World War II. What none of them seemed to consider at the time was that their collaboration might one day be a reason why Speer would be treated far more leniently than others at the heart of Hitler's regime. As for Albert Speer, he spent the next few months being shifted from internment camp to internment camp. The war crimes teams were getting ready for his day of reckoning. Eventually, in November 1945, he would find himself in Nuremberg, where the victorious Allies had constructed a special courtroom. Together with the rest of the surviving Nazi high command, he would be held accountable for his crimes.
Behind the cold, gray facade of this courthouse in Nuremberg, the greatest trial drama of our times begins. Here, the governments of France, Russia, Great Britain, and the United States, representing civilization, oppose the top 20 leaders of an aggressor nation. The big Nazis are being charged with mass crimes against humanity.
Speer now faced the wrath of the Allied court. the Allies wanted a showcase trial conducted on an international scale to show the world that the murder of millions of Jews, complicity in the Holocaust, use of slave labor, and their involvement in Hitler's insane plans would not go unpunished. As the defendants filed in, it seemed like a gathering of old friends. Albert Speer took his place amongst them. They faced 2 judges from each of the big 4 Allied states.
Attention! Tribunal!
The indictment was read out on the morning of November the 20th, 1945.
The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant and so devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored.
All the defendants face the same charges: conspiring to wage war, crimes against the peace, but more significantly,
war crimes. Guilt has been fixed on those who turned Europe into a wilderness of ruin, homelessness, and hunger. Crimes against humanity. Guilt has been fixed on the men who brought death to uncounted millions. To the men behind concentration camp horrors, the world must never forget.
the case against them was damning, especially when filmed evidence of the atrocities committed in the concentration camps was shown to the court.
It must be translated, of course.
Belsen, a camp for political prisoners. They starved. They died.
As Speer sat through the films and listened to the harrowing accounts of witnesses, he was often seen to have tears in his eyes.
Will you state your full name, please? After me. I swear by God.
But when Speer took the stand on June the 21st, 1946, 7 months after the trial had begun, he did something that would surprise everyone.
That I will speak the pure truth.
Oh, his survival strategy was not to deny his association with Hitler. He admitted that because he couldn't deny that. Not to deny the pride he had as a young figure in the Third Reich. He couldn't deny that. But to separate himself, this is very central to his strategy, to separate himself from the other high Nazis, whom he knew we would discover were a bunch of thugs.
Ohne Rücksicht auf das eigene Volk den Krieg fortsetzen wollte. Es war mir klar, dass beim Verlust des Krieges sein Schicksal mit dem des deutschen Volkes verwechselte.
Speer attempted to persuade the court that he had been swept along in the great tide of events, with little or no influence over the evil heart of the Nazi regime, and no knowledge of the Holocaust. The main case against Speer rested on his brutal employment of millions of slaves by the factories under his control. On this count, Hitler's former architect was vulnerable, especially when evidence was produced proving he had been present at various meetings when the use of slave labor was discussed. As he'd not personally been responsible for shipping them in, Speer told the prosecution it was not his job to question the methods employed by his co-defendant, Fritz Sauckel, then Minister of Labor.
Speer
was quite prepared to see Sauckel hang, and Sauckel, under interrogation, said of Speer, "There is a man you should hang." The relations between the two were not exactly warm.
Und Sauckel ließ sich dazu den Auftrag geben, 3,5 Millionen Arbeitskräfte aus den besetzten Gebieten zu holen.
Blaming Sauckel was not the only tactic employed by Speer. Albert Speer did something unprecedented. Something that would set him apart from his co-defendants.
Weil seit dem 20. Juli
he resorted to an apology and an admission of responsibility. But it was an apology with a twist.
Officially, what he said, I didn't know, I should have known, I could have known, but I didn't.
I stated when I was in the witness box that I am responsible for all those things, for all the slave labor. I didn't avoid telling clearly to the judges what I did, and even I felt responsible when it were orders of Hitler. Others accused, they always were claiming that it were orders of Hitler. I didn't do that.
He never said, "I'm guilty." He said, "I am responsible, and I accept the responsibility as a member of that government."
It was a curious defense. Speer accepted culpability while denying any actual knowledge of the crime, a form of guilt with diminished responsibility. In an attempt to prove his anti-Hitler credentials still further, Speer even described how he planned to kill the Führer by dropping a poison gas canister into his bunker through an air intake.
Ich konnte es nur persönlich durchführen, weil seit dem 20. Juli nur ein engerer Kreis noch Zutritt zu Hitler hatte.
His co-defendants laughed it off. The trial lasted until October the 1st, 1946.
The leaders of a nation are brought to judgment for crimes that shocked the entire world. For Goering, death. Dönitz, 10 years. Life imprisonment for Hess and Raeder. Von Ribbentrop, death. And Schirach, 20 years.
The day of reckoning had come for the Nazi elite. The most prominent Nazis paid for their past with their lives. All except one. Astonishingly, Albert Speer got off lightly.
Defendant Albert Speer, the tribunal sentences you to 20 years imprisonment.
Speer's contrition had paid off. He had cheated death.
I think he won a lot of sympathy from the Western judges, not the Russians. The Russians wanted him hanged, but the Americans and the British, at any rate, I think somewhat fell for the line of the grand bourgeois, who would not have got his hands dirty in the real crimes of the regime.
As Speer was led away, there were nagging doubts that some sort of deal had been struck to spare him. Many felt that the chief US prosecutor had not been as tough on him as he had on the others. Had that earlier collaboration with Nitze and his colleagues saved his life? It was a question which would persist for years to come, especially in view of what happened next. On July the 18th, 1947, Albert Speer arrived at Spandau prison in Berlin. He faced 2 decades behind bars. Known simply as prisoner number 5, Speer slipped into a monotonous routine. He read voraciously and tended a small garden. He also, against all the rules, worked on his memoirs, using any scrap of paper he could find. By the mid-1950s, there were calls for Speer's sentence to be commuted, but the Russians were adamant he should serve the full term. Finally, at the stroke of midnight on September the 30th, 1966, after serving his sentence to the day, Speer was released.
But I can tell you that I'm quite glad to be outside here.
He was whisked to a nearby hotel where he held an impromptu press conference.
Oh, monsieur, mon français est trop mauvais.
Quelques mots sur le passé, quelques mots sur l'avenir.
Sur l'avenir. Oh, j'espère que je serai un architecte et que j'ai beaucoup de travail.
Quelle a été votre première impression d'homme libre?
Oh, mon Dieu. Que je suis libre, que c'est beaucoup mieux qu'avant.
Albert Speer now became a media star. In fact, he began to reinvent himself, creating the image of the good Nazi.
Yesterday,
very interesting topic.
Yes, yeah.
He found himself in constant demand for interviews, particularly when the book he'd clandestinely written in Spandau was published in 1970. Entitled Inside the Third Reich, Speer's compelling account of his life and times in Nazi Germany became an international bestseller. Royalties rolled in. Speer became rich. However, awkward questions kept being asked about the good Nazi. In October 1971, Professor Eric Goldhagen, a Harvard historian, wrote an article for an American magazine called Midstream, alleging that Speer knew all about the final solution, the extermination of the Jews. Goldhagen said Speer had been present at a Nazi conference in early October 1943, held in the city of Posen in Poland, where Heinrich Himmler, one of Hitler's leading henchmen, spoke openly about wiping the Jews from the face of the earth.
I realized the significance of the speech because Speer had just published his memoirs in which he denied ever having known of the extermination of the Jews. And there, in that speech, Himmler announces the extermination of the Jews.
Speer responded by admitting he'd been at the conference, but that he'd left before Himmler made his infamous speech. Despite this temporary setback to his reputation, Speer continued to be courted by the media.
They now meet again for the first time in 26 years in a Munich studio.
In 1972, he met his former interrogator George Ball again, along with historian Hugh Trevor Roper, who himself had hunted Nazis after the war.
The final solution was only declared in 1941.
You know that the final solution was a secret, and it was a secret to me too. Of course, he certainly made hateful remarks about the Jews, as they are in the table talks, but not more. And it's very difficult to find out such a secret even if you are in the government.
If either of them viewed Speer as culpable, they went easy on him, as did many journalists and historians of the time.
That was another point which is going apart from this first
No mention was made of Goldhagen's revelations a year earlier. In October 1973, he was given another opportunity to present himself as the good Nazi. He took a trip to England, where he was interviewed by Ludwig Kennedy, the distinguished broadcaster, for a BBC television program.
The end of the war came, and you saw what had happened in the concentration camps.
and you were appalled, and you took, did you not, and you say so in your book very tellingly, you took the guilt of Germany upon yourself.
Yes, I feel the guilt and I feel responsibility, and I think that it's a kind of duty to inform other people how it was, and I don't run away from discussions with students and young people if I'm asked to because that's going on. It's, of course, to me it's not pleasant to always to be pushed in the past. I would like to be somewhere else and having nothing to do with the past, but it's necessary.
Again, the questioning had been gentle.
I'm afraid here, Speer, I must stop you there. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
I think it was, this last thing was quite good.
Yeah, I think it was fine. I think it was fine. I think it was fine.
Speer continued to paint himself as the good Nazi, and his reputation remained intact when, on September the 1st, 1981, he died of a stroke in a London hospital. He had just come from another TV studio after yet another interview. And there it could have ended. Albert Speer, the good Nazi who had said sorry, even though he didn't know what had been going on. But after his death, his true culpability came to light. On May the 11th, 2005, a British newspaper published correspondence between Speer and Himmler in May 1943 concerning the expansion of Auschwitz, the most notorious of all the Nazi death camps. Two of Speer's assistants had toured Auschwitz on the day 900 Polish Jews were sent to the gas chambers. Although they may not have been aware of the mass killing, the assistants must have picked up on the terrible conditions in the camp. And if they did know, surely they would have reported this back to Speer. Two years later, in March 2007, Speer's involvement became even clearer in the damning contents of a letter he'd written in 1971 to the widow of a Belgian resistance leader. In the letter, Speer let slip that he was at the Posen conference in October 1943 and had heard everything Himmler had to say about the extermination of the Jews. Speer had lived with this lie for his last 10 years. The truth had finally been revealed. It confirmed what a great many people had thought all along, that far from being the good Nazi, Speer was just as bad as the rest of them. The myth he'd so elaborately woven around himself had been for one reason only: to save him from the rope. Then it became part of his new identity as the good Nazi. The question for the remaining victims of Nazi war crimes was whether Albert Speer had got off too lightly. Was his sentence of 20 years justice enough, or should he have paid for his crimes with his life?